Across the valleys of the Rhine, where the mist drifts gently over calm waters, there once lived a people who carried the name Burgundians. They were neither as vast as Rome nor as thunderous as the Huns. Yet in the slow rhythm of centuries, they carved out a place in the great story of Europe. Imagine a riverbank at dusk, fires glowing faintly, the sound of voices rising like a lullaby against the endless night. These were the beginnings of a civilization that would one day shape kingdoms, raise cathedrals, and leave behind the taste of wine that still lingers on our lips today. The Burgundians came quietly into history, first whispered of as a tribe along the great northern rivers. They were wanderers, warriors, and farmers, moving through lands that were changing under the weight of Rome's decline. Their steps echoed softly across forests and mountains, settling into valleys that seemed to cradle their future. And as the centuries moved, so too did Burgundy grow, changing from a fleeting name in chronicles into a realm of dukes, merchants, and poets. Tonight, we journey through that story, not with the sharp edge of battles, but with the gentle unfolding of memory. The Burgundians rose and fell, like so many civilizations. Yet in their rise, they built splendor, and in their fall, they left echoes. Let us walk slowly into their world, as the night deepens, and history becomes a quiet companion to sleep. Long before the courts of dukes and the glittering halls of Dijon, the Burgundians were known only as a wandering tribe along the flowing Rhine. Their story begins in the shadow of Rome, when the empire stretched wide but trembled under its own weight. To imagine the Burgundians, then, is to see a people bound to the rhythm of river and forest, small villages with wooden huts, smoke rising in thin trails into the sky, and the sound of children playing beside the water. Their lives were marked not by conquest, but by survival, by seasons, and by the quiet strength of community. The Romans wrote of them with curiosity and unease. They were not as vast as the Goths, nor as fierce as the Huns. Yet they lingered close enough to Rome's borders to be noticed. In the evenings, Burgundian warriors would gather by firelight, their spears stacked nearby, while elders told stories of the old lands they had crossed. The Rhine was not just a boundary of water, it was a lifeline. Its fish sustained them, its trade paths connected them, and its mist seemed to cloak their presence from the restless empires beyond. Still, history rarely allows any people to remain untouched. As Rome weakened in the 3rd and 4th centuries, pressures rose like storms on every frontier. Other tribes pushed westward, searching for new homes, and the Burgundians too were drawn into this slow tide of migration. Some accounts place them near the Baltic in earlier centuries, drifting south toward the Rhine as generations passed. Whether legend or truth, what matters is that they arrived at the river valleys and, for a time, found a place to belong. The Burgundians of these early centuries were not yet kings or dukes, but their character was already forming. They prized loyalty among kin, cherished feasts where mead was poured generously, and upheld courage as a quiet expectation. Women wove cloth by the hearth, while men hunted deer in the forests. It was a simple life. But within that simplicity lay the seeds of endurance. They had not yet raised stone walls or built great churches, but their identity was already clear. They were Burgundians, and they carried their name with them wherever they wandered. Tales speak of their first clashes with Rome. Sometimes they fought as enemies, raiding villages or pushing into Roman lands. Other times, they became foederati, federated allies, sworn to defend imperial borders in exchange for land or gold. This duality defined much of their early existence, neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian, but something in between, standing on the threshold of history. It was a precarious balance, and yet it allowed them to endure while greater powers crumbled. By the early 5th century, the Burgundians had grown bold enough to establish a kingdom on the west bank of the Rhine, near Worms. This kingdom was fragile, perched between the ambitions of Rome and the turbulence of neighboring tribes. But it was a beginning. For the first time, the Burgundians were not just wanderers, they were settlers, claiming land and identity. Wooden halls were built, banners were raised, and chieftains began to dream of crowns. But the Rhine could not shield them forever. In 436, a catastrophe struck. The Burgundian kingdom at Worms fell to destruction, crushed in a campaign led by the Roman general Aetius, with the aid of Hunnic mercenaries. The city was sacked, its warriors slain, and its dreams shattered. The Rhine, once a cradle, became a grave for thousands. The memory of Worms would linger in legend, woven into later tales like the Nibelungenlied, where tragedy and destiny entwined with the name of Burgundy. Yet even in ruin, the Burgundians endured. Survivors gathered, moved southward, and sought refuge in new valleys. Their story, like the slow bending of a river, would find another course. They left behind the ashes of Worms and began again, this time in the shadow of the Alps, where a new Burgundy would one day rise. And so, the first echoes of the Burgundians faded along the Rhine. Their beginning was marked not by triumph, but by resilience, a people learning that kingdoms may fall, but names can carry forward. In the quiet flow of centuries, the Burgundians had taken their first steps into history. When the Burgundians left behind the broken dreams of Worms, their footsteps carried them southward. It was a slow migration, not a sudden march. Families moved with carts, oxen pulled what little could be saved, and elders walked side by side with children. They were not alone in this wandering. The roads of the 5th century were filled with tribes seeking shelter from wars and famine. Yet somehow, the Burgundians kept their sense of belonging intact. Their name remained their anchor. Even when their homeland had been lost, the Roman Empire, fractured and weary, allowed them a place within its borders. In the region of Sapaudia, what we now call Savoy, the Burgundians found valleys green with vineyards and hills that rolled gently toward the mountains. Here, for the first time since Worms, they felt the possibility of permanence. Houses were rebuilt, all fields were tilled, and churches began to rise in stone. The murmurs of prayers replaced the cries of loss, and a kingdom slowly grew among the foothills of the Alps. This new realm, the kingdom of the Burgundians, was more than survival. It was renewal. Kings such as Gundobad shaped the land with laws and alliances. Under his rule in the late 5th and early 6th century, the Burgundians began to blend Roman traditions with their own. They kept their warrior spirit but embraced the written word, codifying customs into what became known as the Lex Burgundionum. It was not a perfect law, but it gave structure a sense that the Burgundians were no longer just a wandering people, but a true society. Life in this kingdom carried a gentle rhythm. Villages nestled among the vineyards. Farmers tended grapes, pressing them into wine that would one day give Burgundy its timeless name. Shepherds led flocks along the slopes, and craftsmen shaped wood and iron into tools. In the evenings, songs echoed across the valleys, a reminder that even in uncertain times, culture could flourish. Yet, as always in history, peace was fragile. To the west lay the growing power of the Franks, led by kings who dreamed of expansion. To the south stretched the fading shadow of Rome's empire, now centered in Ravenna, but losing strength each year. The Burgundians stood between these worlds, vulnerable yet determined. Conflicts came in waves, sometimes as skirmishes, sometimes as uneasy truces sealed with marriages between royal houses. One such union was between Clotilde, a Burgundian princess, and Clovis, king of the Franks. Their marriage would change the course of Europe. Clotilde's faith as a Christian influenced Clovis, who eventually converted to Catholic Christianity, a moment that reshaped the destiny of the Frankish kingdom and, in time, the whole of medieval Europe. Thus, through a quiet thread of faith and family, the Burgundians left an imprint far greater than their size might suggest. But destiny often weaves triumph with tragedy. In 534, the Burgundian kingdom was conquered by the Franks. The vineyards and valleys of Savoy, the halls of their kings, all fell under Frankish control. Once again, the Burgundians faced the silence of defeat. Their banners no longer flew. Their laws were absorbed into those of stronger rulers, and their independence was gone. And yet, something of their spirit lingered. Rather than vanish, they merged into the greater fabric of Gaul. Their vineyards continued to flourish. Their traditions seeped into the life of the Franks, and their memory endured in names and songs. Though their kingdom ended, the Burgundians themselves did not disappear. They became part of something larger, and in doing so, their story carried forward. The kingdom in the west had lasted less than a century, a brief spark in the long expanse of time, but it was enough to root their name firmly in the soil of Europe. From here, Burgundy would no longer be just a wandering tribe. It would become a land, a culture, and, in centuries to come, a symbol of power and wealth that reached far beyond its valleys. As the Alps watched in silence, the Burgundians entered a new chapter not as kings of their own realm, but as part of a changing Europe. Their story, like the vines growing on gentle slopes, would continue to stretch across generations, quietly shaping the world that followed. The Burgundian kingdom in Sapoudia had been a fragile jewel. It shimmered for a moment under alpine skies. But like so many kingdoms of the early Middle Ages, it did not last. In the year 534, the Franks marched south and absorbed the Burgundian lands into their growing realm. The banners of Burgundy were lowered, and with them went the independence of a people who had once dreamed of permanence. But the story did not end in silence. History is rarely a straight line. Though the Burgundian kingdom fell, the name Burgundy continued to live, whispered in valleys, spoken by monks in scriptoria, and remembered in vineyards where families still tended vines. The people themselves blended with Franks, Gallo-Romans, and other neighbors, carrying forward their customs like embers hidden in ash. The centuries that followed were times of migration and transformation across Europe. The Roman world had collapsed, leaving a patchwork of tribes, lords, and shifting powers. The Burgundians, no longer rulers of their own realm, became part of this larger mosaic. They settled into Burgundy proper, a region stretching between the Rhone and the Saône rivers, where fertile lands offered both shelter and opportunity. It was here, in this new Burgundy, that their identity quietly reshaped itself. No longer simply a tribe or a conquered kingdom, Burgundy became a region, a land whose name would endure through dynasties, dukes, and centuries of change. Its valleys were lush with vineyards, its hills dotted with villages, and its monasteries began to rise in stone, echoing with chants that softened the memory of war. The monks of Cluny, founded in the 10th century, would later make Burgundy a center of spiritual renewal. But even before Cluny, the seeds of faith had already taken root. After Clotilde's influence on Clovis, Christianity spread through Burgundian lands, giving the people a new anchor. Chapels appeared where forests once stood. Bells rang softly across meadows. The old warrior identity of the Burgundians faded into memory, replaced by a key to devotion. And yet, there remained in Burgundy a sense of resilience, a refusal to vanish. The Franks may have ruled, but Burgundy kept its flavor quite literally in the vines that covered its hillsides. The making of wine became not only an economic lifeline, but also a cultural signature. To drink Burgundy wine was to taste the land itself. And in that taste, the Burgundian name endured. In these centuries, migration was not only physical, but also cultural. The Burgundians migrated from being a distinct tribe into becoming part of medieval France. Their identity was woven into a broader tapestry, but the threads remained visible. Chronicles spoke of Burgundy as a region with its own customs. Poets sang of its valleys, and merchants carried its goods to distant markets. The collapse of their kingdom might have ended a political dream, but it allowed something more enduring to take root. Kingdoms rise and fall, but lands remain. And Burgundy, as a land, grew stronger with time. Its duchies would one day rival kings. Its courts would rival empires, and its culture would flourish beyond the measure of its size. To imagine Burgundy in these centuries is to picture a countryside at twilight vineyards stretching in neat rows, smoke curling from the chimneys of farmhouses, and stone churches where candles glowed softly in the dusk. It was no longer the world of wandering warriors by the Rhine. It was something new settled, fertile, resilient. Thus, the Burgundians did not vanish with their collapse. They migrated in spirit, in culture, and in memory. From tribe to kingdom, from kingdom to region, they carried their name across centuries. And though the Franks claimed their crown, the Burgundians claimed something far more lasting, a place in the geography and imagination of Europe. As history moved on, Burgundy would rise again, not as an ancient tribe, but as a duchy whose wealth, power, and brilliance would one day rival kings and emperors. For now, in the quiet centuries after collapse, Burgundy waited, its valleys and vineyards preparing to bloom once more. In the centuries that followed the fall of Rome, Europe reshaped itself into a mosaic of kingdoms and duchies. Among them, the lands of Burgundy lay quietly, yet never without importance. The Burgundians themselves had blended into the greater fabric of the Franks, but their valleys and vineyards still carried the weight of their name. By the 8th and 9th centuries, Burgundy found itself within the great reach of the Carolingian Empire, the realm forged by Charlemagne. His empire stretched wide, from the Atlantic to the heart of Central Europe, and within this vast dominion, Burgundy stood as both a prize and a partner. The hills of Burgundy produced wine, the plains offered grain, and its abbeys glowed as centers of learning and prayer. Charlemagne valued Burgundy's richness. Monasteries such as those at Autun and later at Cluny became fountains of knowledge, where monks copied texts by candlelight, preserving wisdom from the ancient world. The rhythm of monastic bells carried across Burgundy's valleys, calling the faithful to prayer. These abbeys became not only religious centers but also economic engines, owning lands, managing vineyards, and shaping the cultural life of the region. Under Carolingian rule, Burgundy's identity was not erased. Instead, it became layered part Burgundian, part Frankish, part Christian Europe. Lords ruled in the emperor's name, yet local customs endured. Farmers still tended the soil as their ancestors had. Markets bustled with merchants carrying salt, cloth, and wine. And above it all, the great churches rose higher each generation, their arches and stained glass a reflection of both devotion and prosperity. But shadows lingered. The Carolingian Empire, though mighty under Charlemagne, struggled after his death. His heirs divided the realm, splitting it into kingdoms and sub-kingdoms that often quarreled. Burgundy, caught between these shifting boundaries, was sometimes a pawn in dynastic struggles. Kings of West Francia and kings of the East claimed rights over it. Treaties redrew its borders, while marriages reshaped its allegiances. For the people of Burgundy, these centuries were a time of continuity rather than upheaval. Life moved in cycles: planting, harvest, festivals, and winters. Villages thrived under the protection of lords, and local courts settled disputes in ways that blended Roman law with Burgundian custom. Although the grand politics of Europe swirled above them, most Burgundians lived lives anchored to the land. Yet the shadows deepened in the 9th and 10th centuries as waves of external threats swept across Europe. Vikings sailed down rivers, their longships cutting through coasts and valleys. Saracen raiders pressed northward, and Magyars rode from the plains. Burgundy, is expression, though inland, felt the tremors of these movements. Castles began to rise on hilltops, not only as symbols of power, but as refuges for villagers in times of fear. It was during these turbulent times that Burgundy's resilience shone. Rather than crumble, it adapted. Lords fortified their lands, abbeys grew stronger, and communities pulled together. In this way, Burgundy weathered the storm of invasions, emerging into the 11th century, not diminished, but prepared for a new age of prominence. The Carolingian shadows were both a burden and a blessing. They placed Burgundy within a vast empire, subject to distant rulers and dynastic struggles. Yet they also tied Burgundy into the heart of medieval Europe, linking it by trade, faith, and culture to lands as far away as Spain, Italy, and the German states. To walk through Burgundy in this age is to picture stone churches rising above vineyards, market towns filled with chatter, and monasteries humming with prayer. It was a land both shadowed by great empires and illuminated by its own quiet strength. As the Carolingian world faded into fragments, Burgundy was ready to step forward once more. The dukes who would rise in the centuries to come would transform it into one of the most dazzling courts in Europe. But for now, in the gentle centuries of Carolingian rule, Burgundy learned patience, endurance, and the art of flourishing even under shadow. By the late Middle Ages, Burgundy had risen once more, not as a wandering tribe or a forgotten kingdom, but as one of the most dazzling powers in Europe. From the 14th to the 15th centuries, the Dukes of Burgundy created a court that rivaled kings, a realm that stretched from the vineyards of Dijon to the bustling cities of Flanders. This was the golden Burgundy that Europe remembered, not for collapse, but for splendor. The duchy itself was technically under the crown of France, yet the Dukes of Burgundy wielded power so vast that they often acted like sovereign rulers, through careful marriages, bold diplomacy, and shrewd inheritance. The dukes gathered lands that made Burgundy both rich and influential. The Low Countries, Bruges, Ghent, Brussels were drawn into their orbit, giving them access to trade routes, wealth, and the flowering of art. At the heart of this power stood the ducal court, centered first in Dijon and later in the northern cities. Imagine a hall lit by hundreds of candles, banners hanging from wooden beams, and tables set with silver and wine. Musicians played softly, while poets recited verses, and knights in polished armor stood guard at the edges of the chamber. It was a world of ceremony, refinement, and magnificence. The most famous among the dukes was Philip the Bold, who began the line's rise in the late 14th century. He was followed by his son, John the Fearless, a man of both ambition and conflict. Then came Philip the Good, under whom Burgundy reached its zenith. His court became the center of chivalry and culture, where painters such as Jan van Eyck found patronage, and where the Order of the Golden Fleece was founded, a knightly order that symbolized loyalty, honor, and brilliance. Under Philip the Good, Burgundy was not merely a duchy, it was almost a kingdom in its own right. Trade flowed through its cities, filling coffers with wealth. Art flourished, with painters, sculptors, and architects creating masterpieces that still inspire awe. Festivals lit the streets, where processions wound through crowds, and wine flowed in abundance. Burgundy had become not just a place, but an idea, a vision of medieval glory. Yet, amid this magnificence, the dukes also carried the burdens of power. Rivalry with France was constant, for the kings in Paris watched uneasily as Burgundy grew stronger. The 100 Years' War brought shifting alliances, and Burgundy often chose its own path, sometimes siding with England against France. These choices carved deep scars but also showed the independence of the duchy. For the people, however, Burgundy's golden age was a time of prosperity. Farmers prospered from trade, merchants grew wealthy in cities, and artists found patrons who valued their craft. The vineyards of Burgundy expanded, producing wines that graced tables across Europe. Town squares bustled with life. Guilds organized festivals, and church towers rose higher into the sky. To drift through Burgundy in this age is to see a land at its most radiant. Candlelight flickered in grand halls. Church bells rang across valleys, and markets overflowed with cloth, spices, and silver. It was not just a duchy, it was a beacon, admired and envied across the continent. Still, beneath the splendor, shadows gathered. Power that shines so brightly often attracts envy and conflict. The dukes knew this, but for now, they basked in their glory. Burgundy, under their rule, had become one of the richest, most refined realms of Europe, a jewel of the Middle Ages, and a chapter of history that seemed destined never to fade. But history, as always, would move onward. For now, in the time of the dukes, Burgundy was at its height, a place where wealth, culture, and ambition intertwined, leaving behind memories that still echo in Europe's imagination today. If Burgundy's heart beat in its vineyards and valleys, its lifeblood flowed northward into the cities of Flanders. For it was in this union between the ducal lands of Burgundy and the bustling towns of the Low Countries that the duchy found its greatest wealth and its most dazzling brilliance. Together, Burgundy and Flanders created a realm of merchants, artists, and nobles, where culture and commerce intertwined like golden threads in a tapestry. The marriage of Philip the Bold to Margaret of Flanders in 1369 was more than a union of two houses. It was a marriage of wine and cloth, of vineyards and harbours, of southern hills and northern markets. Through it, Burgundy gained access to Bruges, Ghent, and Brussels, the beating heart of medieval trade. Ships sailed from the North Sea, carrying wool, spices, and silks, while caravans rolled in from across Europe. The wealth that flowed into these cities enriched the dukes and allowed them to build courts that rivaled kings. To walk the streets of Bruges in this time was to step into a world of colour and sound. Merchants from Italy, England, and the Baltic gathered in its squares, their stalls heavy with goods. Cloth halls rose in stone, filled with the sound of weavers and traders. Inns bustled with travellers speaking many tongues, and guild banners fluttered above narrow canals. At dusk, the bells of St. Donatian's church rang softly across the city, a reminder that beneath the commerce, faith still anchored daily life. The wealth of Flanders allowed Burgundy to become not just a political power but a cultural beacon. Painters like Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden found patrons in the ducal court, producing works of luminous detail that seemed to capture both heaven and earth. Illuminated manuscripts glowed with gold leaf, and tapestries told stories of knights and saints in threads of scarlet, azure, and gold. Music, too, flourished, as choirs filled cathedrals with polyphonic hymns that echoed across the Low Countries and beyond. For the common people, the union brought both prosperity and tension. Farmers and craftsmen benefited from the demand for goods, while guilds grew powerful, shaping the politics of cities. Markets swelled with prosperity. Yet independence-minded towns like Ghent and Bruges sometimes resisted ducal control. Strikes and uprisings broke out, reminding the Dukes of Burgundy that riches did not guarantee peace. At times, negotiations had to be sealed, not by swords, but by careful compromise, as merchants valued their privileges as fiercely as knights valued their honor. Philip the Good, more than any other, understood the importance of Flanders. He made Bruges and later Brussels centers of his court, filling them with festivals, pageants, and ceremonies. Tournaments dazzled spectators, and great banquets displayed the abundance of Burgundy's wealth. In 1430, he founded the Order of the Golden Fleece, which embodied the union of chivalry and prosperity, binding nobles across Burgundy and Flanders into a brotherhood of loyalty. To wear its emblem was to stand among Europe's most honored. The imagery of Burgundy and Flanders in this era is one of light and abundance. Candlelit halls shimmered with jewels and brocades. Processions wound through city streets, their banners fluttering in the wind. Markets overflowed with fabrics dyed in deep crimson and rich indigo, while barrels of Burgundy wine rolled into harbor warehouses, destined for distant lands. It was a world where art, all faith, and trade seemed to walk hand in hand. Still, beneath the brilliance, shadows gathered. France watched with suspicion, wary of a duchy that grew stronger with every alliance. England, too, sought influence in Flanders, for its wool trade depended on the looms of Ghent and Bruges. Burgundy stood at the crossroads of Europe's rivalries, enriched by its position, but also endangered by it. The dukes, for all their splendor, were constantly aware that wealth could both protect and expose. And yet, for those who lived in Burgundy and Flanders during this golden age, the memory was one of magnificence. Merchants recalled bustling markets. Monks remembered illuminated books glowing under candlelight, and farmers tasted prosperity in the harvest of their fields. All who passed through these lands spoke of their brilliance. So it was that Burgundy and Flanders together became more than lands on a map. They became a vision of medieval glory, a reminder that when commerce, art, and power align, history can produce a light so radiant that it lingers long after the banners have fallen. The 15th century was Burgundy's hour of brilliance, the time when its court seemed to outshine even the kingdoms around it. This was the Golden Age, when wealth, art, and ceremony blended into a spectacle of medieval grandeur. To speak of Burgundy in this era was to speak of magnificence, for no other court appeared so refined, so dazzling, or so admired. At the center of this splendor stood Philip the Good. Under his long reign, Burgundy reached its cultural and political peak. His court, first in Dijon and later in Brussels, became a beacon that drew poets, painters, musicians, and knights from across Europe. Candlelight glittered on polished armor, on jeweled gowns, and on illuminated manuscripts that glowed with gold leaf. The atmosphere of the court was more than politics, it was theater, ritual, and artistry woven into daily life. Festivals filled the calendar. In towns like Bruges and Lille, pageants paraded through streets crowded with citizens. Costumed figures reenacted biblical stories and heroic legends. Banners waved above wooden stages, and music filled the air as choirs sang in harmony. For the people of Burgundy, these festivals were not only entertainment, but also a way of experiencing the grandeur of their rulers, of feeling part of something greater than themselves. Music was one of the jewels of this golden age. The Burgundian school of composers, with figures such as Guillaume Dufay, transformed sacred and secular music alike. Their polyphonic chants resonated in cathedral choirs, blending voices into layers of sound that seemed to reach toward heaven. At feasts and tournaments, minstrels played softer melodies, their lutes and harps adding to the atmosphere of elegance. To listen to Burgundian music was to feel both majesty and intimacy, a sound that captured the spirit of the age. Painting, too, flourished as never before. Jan van Eyck, though born in the Low Countries, found his place under Burgundian patronage. His portraits captured faces with startling realism, while his altarpieces glowed with divine light. Rogier van der Weyden, another master, infused his works with emotion, giving saints and mourners expressions that seemed to breathe with life. These painters turned the dukes and their court into icons, preserving the image of Burgundy's brilliance for centuries to come. The Order of the Golden Fleece, founded in 1430, symbolized the duchy's prestige. Its ceremonies were filled with ritual and splendor. Knights dressed in rich robes embroidered with gold thread, while the emblem of the fleece hung from chains at their necks. To belong to this order was to belong to the very heart of Europe's nobility, a circle where loyalty and honor were bound together by wealth and power. The common people, too, felt the effects of the Golden Age. Farmers saw prosperity in fertile harvests. Merchants thrived as markets expanded, their goods reaching England, Italy, and the Baltic. Craftsmen in Bruges, Ghent, and Brussels produced textiles so fine they were sought after across the continent. Even the humblest villagers experienced glimpses of the duchy's glory during fairs, where wine flowed and music played long into the night. To walk through Burgundy in this age was to see beauty everywhere. Cathedrals rose with pointed spires, their stained glass glowing with colors of sapphire and ruby. Castles stood strong on their hilltops, yet softened by gardens where fountains murmured. In city squares, guild halls shone with carvings and statues, while canals reflected the lights of lanterns. The air itself seemed to shimmer with prosperity. And yet, even amid such brilliance, time moved gently forward. The Golden Age was not eternal, though it felt as though it might be. For now, Burgundy basked in its light. The dukes ruled with majesty. The people thrived, and art and music flourished in a harmony rarely seen in medieval Europe. This was Burgundy at its most radiant. A duchy that had become the envy of kings and the marvel of travelers. Long after its political power would fade, the memory of this golden age would remain. The paintings, the music, the wine, and the stories would carry forward the image of Burgundy not as a fallen realm, but as a shining jewel in the crown of history. As Burgundy reached its golden height, its brilliance did not go unnoticed. To shine so brightly in medieval Europe was to invite shadows, and the shadows came in the form of rivals. France, once the duchy's overlord, grew uneasy as the Dukes of Burgundy acted with near sovereign power, and to the east, the Habsburgs, rising in strength within the Holy Roman Empire, also cast their gaze upon Burgundy's lands. Between these giants, Burgundy stood proud but vulnerable. The kings of France had long considered the dukes their vassals. Yet, by the 15th century, the dukes behaved less like subjects and more like equals. They held territories that stretched across modern France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Their wealth from Flanders often surpassed that of the French crown itself. In Paris, this growing power was a source of resentment. Burgundy was technically part of France, yet it often chose its own alliances, even siding with England during the 100 Years' War. Tensions simmered and sometimes erupted. Skirmishes broke out along borders, and assassinations marked the rivalry. In 1419, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, was killed on a bridge at Montereau, lured into negotiations and then struck down by French loyalists. His death deepened the rift, turning distrust into open hostility. For the Burgundians, it was a bitter reminder that their independence came at a cost. Even as France loomed as a rival, another power stirred to the east. The Habsburgs, though not yet the sprawling dynasty they would become, were already securing lands through marriage and inheritance. Their strength in Austria and beyond placed them in natural competition with Burgundy, whose territories bordered the empire. As generations passed, the marriage ties between the Habsburgs and Burgundian heirs would reshape Europe's map, binding Burgundy into larger struggles that reached far beyond its vineyards and courts. For the people of Burgundy, these rivalries were distant thunder. Farmers continued to tend their fields. Monks copied manuscripts, and merchants sold their wares in crowded markets. Yet the signs of strain were visible. Taxes rose to fund armies. Castles were reinforced. Their walls thickened for siege. And in towns, whispers carried unease about the ambitions of both dukes and kings. Philip the Good managed these rivalries with diplomacy, balancing alliances carefully. He played France and England against each other, maintaining Burgundy's independence while enriching its coffers. But his successors inherited a world less forgiving. By the mid-15th century, the 100 Years' War was ending, and France was consolidating power under strong monarchs. Burgundy's independence was becoming harder to maintain. Still, the court of Burgundy shone with ceremony, perhaps as a defense against the gathering storm. Banquets, tournaments, and festivals displayed its wealth and culture, reminding Europe that the duchy was not a mere province, but a power in its own right. The Order of the Golden Fleece stood as a symbol of loyalty, even as the world around it grew more treacherous. The rivalry with France and the pressure from the Habsburgs created a precarious balance. Burgundy was rich, cultured, and proud, but it was also caught between two giants. To walk through Burgundy in this age was to sense both splendor and fragility, candlelight flickering in great halls, even as the sound of distant drums echoed in memory. And so, Burgundy's golden brilliance carried within it the seeds of conflict. To stand tall between France and the Habsburgs was to live under constant tension, a reminder that power and envy are inseparable companions in history. For now, Burgundy remained radiant, but the rivals at its borders waited, and time would test whether the duchy could endure their gaze. Among the Dukes of Burgundy, none was more ambitious than Charles the Bold. He inherited not only the wealth of his ancestors, but also their dreams of sovereignty. For Charles, Burgundy was not merely a duchy beneath France, it was a kingdom waiting to be born. A realm that could stand alongside the greatest powers of Europe. His vision was vast, and his will was unyielding. Charles expanded his territories with determination. He sought to unite Burgundy's scattered lands from the vineyards of the south to the bustling cities of the Low Countries into a single, independent crown. He dreamed of stretching his dominion from the North Sea to the Alps, creating a middle kingdom that would rival both France and the Holy Roman Empire. To those around him, he was both admired and admired for his courage, feared for his intensity. His court reflected his ambition. Tournaments grew more elaborate. His armies marched with greater discipline, and his diplomats worked tirelessly to secure recognition of his kingship. Yet, ambition often courts danger. The kings of France saw Charles as a threat, while the Swiss Confederation, a rising force of disciplined soldiers, refused to bow to his power. Enemies gathered, and the stage was set for tragedy. The turning point came in the 1472. Charles's campaigns against the Swiss brought him into rugged alpine valleys where his knights found themselves at odds with pikemen and militias. The battles were fierce, the terrain unforgiving. At Grandson in 1476, Charles suffered a humiliating defeat, losing treasure, artillery, and honor. Later that year, at Morat, his army was crushed again, the Swiss pikes breaking the pride of Burgundy's chivalry. Each loss chipped away at his dream. But Charles refused to yield. In January 1477, Charles faced his final reckoning at the Battle of Nancy. The winter air was bitter cold, the fields covered in snow. His army, weary and diminished, met the forces of Lorraine and their Swiss allies. The clash was brutal. Burgundy's banners fluttered bravely in the wind. But the outcome was inevitable. Surrounded and outnumbered, Charles fought to the end. When the battle was over, he lay lifeless on the frozen ground, his body so battered it was scarcely recognized. With his death, the great dream of Burgundy collapsed in an instant. The duchy's lands were divided, some claimed by France, others passing to the Habsburgs through the marriage of Mary of Burgundy to Maximilian of Austria. What Charles had tried to unite was scattered, absorbed into powers far larger than Burgundy itself. The jewel of Europe, so radiant in the 15th century, was shattered. For the people of Burgundy, the fall was both sudden and profound. The grand court festivals ended, the ducal splendor faded, and the independence they had once known was gone. Towns that had thrived under Burgundian rule adjusted to new masters. Vineyards still produced wine. Markets still bustled. But the sense of living under a glorious duchy had passed into memory. And yet, the legacy of Charles and his ancestors lingered. The art they commissioned, the music they inspired, and the culture they fostered remained as echoes of their greatness.
Painters' canvases, manuscripts' pages, and the very stones of their castles continued to tell the story of a duchy that had dared to rival kings. To picture Burgundy after Nancy is to imagine a land quiet under winter skies, its castles standing in silence, its people continuing their daily lives. The ambition of Charles had burned too brightly, and like many flames, it consumed itself. But the memory of his fall and of the splendor that preceded it would endure, woven into the larger history of Europe.
Thus ended the independent dream of Burgundy. What remained was not a kingdom, but a legend. The legend of dukes who turned a duchy into one of the greatest courts of medieval Europe, only to see it vanish in a single winter's battle. The fall of Charles the Bold marked the end of Burgundy as an independent power. But it was not the end of Burgundy's story. Civilizations do not simply vanish, they transform, leaving behind traces that shape the centuries to come. Burgundy, though divided between France and the Habsburgs, lived on in its culture, its wine, its art, and its memory. The duchy's lands became prizes in the larger game of European politics. Through the marriage of Mary of Burgundy to Maximilian of Austria, vast territories passed into Habsburg hands, laying the foundation for the dynastic struggles that would dominate Europe for generations. France claimed other parts, folding them into its expanding crown. Burgundy, once proud and nearly sovereign, was scattered. Yet, in the minds of poets, painters, and travelers, the name still evoked magnificence. The legacy of Burgundy's golden age endured most vividly in art and culture. The paintings of Jan van Eyck, Rogier van der Weyden, and their successors continued to inspire awe long after the dukes who had commissioned them were gone. Tapestries from Burgundian workshops adorned courts across Europe, telling stories not just of saints and heroes, but of the richness of a culture that had flourished under ducal patronage. The music of the Burgundian school echoed in cathedrals, influencing generations of composers. In the monasteries and churches of Burgundy, the stones themselves spoke of continuity. Cluny and its offspring carried forward a tradition of prayer and architecture that spread across Christendom. Cathedrals rose with stained glass glowing in morning light, a reminder that faith outlives kingdoms. And in vineyards stretching across the hills of Beaune and Dijon, the rhythms of harvest carried on year after year, producing wines that bore the name of Burgundy, a name that even kings could not erase. For ordinary people, the duchy's memory was woven into daily life. Fairs and festivals continued, though without the grandeur of ducal processions. Guilds still celebrated their saints. Villages still rang bells at dawn and dusk. The dukes were gone, but the culture they had nurtured lingered, not as distant history, but as living tradition. Travelers who passed through Burgundy in later centuries often spoke of a land both quiet and rich. They admired its wines, its churches, its markets. Some still recalled tales of dukes and their golden courts, told by local storytellers who refused to let the past be forgotten. Even as Europe moved into the modern age, Burgundy remained in imagination as a place of elegance and memory. In truth, the legacy of Burgundy was not only in its lands, but also in its example. It showed that even a duchy technically subordinate, caught between great powers, could, through wealth, art, and ambition, shape the course of European history. It was a reminder that power is not measured only in crowns or armies, but in culture, in the beauty one leaves behind. To reflect on Burgundy now is to see both splendor and fragility. Its rise was dazzling, its fall abrupt, but its memory enduring. The vineyards still yield wine that carries the Burgundian name to every corner of the world. The art and music created under its dukes still grace museums and choirs, and the story of its dukes and dreamers still whispers in Europe's chronicles. like candlelight flickering long after the hall has grown dark. Thus, Burgundy lives on. Not as a kingdom, not as a duchy, but as a legacy, a reminder that civilizations may fall, but their spirit lingers. To sip Burgundy wine, to stand before a Van Eyck painting, or to hear polyphonic hymns in a cathedral is to touch that legacy. It is to feel, however faintly, the echo of a people who once stood between empires and, for a shining moment, lit all of Europe with their brilliance. Night falls gently over the valleys of Burgundy. The castles that once rang with music stand in silence, their stones softened by ivy and time. The voices of dukes and knights have faded, yet the land still remembers. In every vineyard, in every bell tower, there is a trace of their presence. Civilizations rise and fall like the turning of seasons. The Burgundians began as wanderers along the Rhine, became kings in Sapaudia, and then, for a glorious moment, ruled a duchy that shone brighter than many kingdoms. Their end came swiftly on a snowy field, yet their spirit endured in ways they could not have imagined. Today, we taste Burgundy in its wines, hear it in the music preserved by choirs, and see it in the luminous colors of paintings that still hang in quiet museums. These are the echoes of a people who lived, dreamed, and vanished into history, yet never fully disappeared. As you rest now, let the story of Burgundy remind you that nothing is ever truly lost. Every life, every people, leaves a mark, sometimes grand, sometimes subtle, but always present in the memory of the world. The Burgundians are gone, but their echo lingers, gentle as the night.